Good afternoon, everyone. The subcommittee will come to order. The purpose of today's hearing is to receive testimony on 15 bills pending before the Public Lands, Forests, and Mining Subcommittee. Because of the large number of bills on today's agenda, I'm not going to go through all of them right now, but the complete agenda will, of course, be included in the record. I want to note at the outset we've got a former member of our committee here, former Senator Mary Landrieu from Louisiana, a longtime member of the Senate and of this committee is with us in the back. And we've got members who will be joining us shortly who have another committee assignment at the moment. We have others who will be joining us telephonically. I also want to begin by recognizing the staggering loss of life that has occurred and embedded within what has shaped up to be a really horrific wildfire season. More than 36 people have perished in infernos raging throughout the western United States this year. Dozens more are missing. In Oregon, my colleague Senator Wyden's home state, thousands have lost their homes and over 500,000 people were evacuated last week alone. In my home state of Utah and elsewhere in the West, we've got wind-driven fires that continue to spread across our federal, state, tribal, and public lands. With all these wildfires raging throughout the West, I was thrilled to see that we would be receiving testimony on legislation to address the management of our federal forests. I strongly believe that the megafires we're watching on TV could have, in many, many instances, been prevented if only active management practices had been implemented. As many of you are probably aware, forests have been shaped and have been influenced by fire for certainly as long as our species has been around and even longer. Cycles of burning and regrowth are completely natural. They aren't a new feature of current climate conditions, as some would have us believe. These fires weren't unpredictable. They were predictable, and in fact, they were predicted. We could have prepared for them. But the management of our forests has regrettably become hamstrung, partly by regulations promulgated by bureaucrats, often operating many thousands of miles away from the lands that they're in charge of administering. For example, regulations under the Clean Air Act perversely and most likely unintentionally work to discourage the practice of letting fires burn, especially in those areas that have air pollution levels that exceed permissible standards. In these instances, they may favor reactive short-term fire suppression at the expense of heightened long-term risks. When Congress imagined activities like prescribed burns or removal of snag trees, Congress did not foresee a regulatory Byzantine labyrinth that led to litigation at every term. Litigation that in many instances would end up forestalling the taking of precautionary measures and ultimately could lead to fires that could in turn lead to the loss of life and environmental catastrophe. Management of our forests has moved away from proactive measures, largely out of fear, quite legitimate and well-founded fear of being sued. This in turn has led to bigger fires, threatening greater numbers of lives, livelihoods, and homes. In many cases, it has also resulted in additional and worse air pollution than would have otherwise been the case had prescribed burns been allowed to occur or forest overgrowth been eliminated. Research tells us that between 4.4 million and 11.8 million acres burned each year in prehistoric California. Between 1982 and 1998, California's agency land managers burned on average about 30,000 acres a year. Between 1999 and 2017, that number dropped to an annual 13,000 acres. That is a tremendous gap between the natural cycle and what our forest management efforts have provided. Now, I'm grateful that we have skilled emergency personnel who help prevent tragedy from forest fire. These brave women and men put their lives on the line during the course of their work and do so on a regular basis and quite heroically. They're a necessary part of our forest management strategy. We can do more to ease the burden that they face with targeted controlled burns and with removal of excess fuel that builds up within our forests. With these burns, people can plan ahead, get out of town, install a HEPA filter in their house, make a rational plan to meet their needs. Furthermore, the fire suppression and military style of firefighting can be more environmentally destructive in some cases than controlled burns or in some rare instances than the wildfire itself. Suppression tactics often include cutting down large snags, bulldozing miles of ridge tops, and lighting high-severity fires to control the fire behavior. I believe that a large portion of this could be prevented if local agencies and federal partners could sidestep illogical regulatory barriers and address the obvious problems that lead to catastrophe. I hope that today we can make real progress in addressing the needs of communities put at risk by poor management practices. Additionally, on the hearing agenda today are a number of bills relating to the proper management of our public lands, including the Miracle Mountain Designation Act, which I've introduced in the Senate. This bill memorializes the events surrounding the Bald Mountain Fire of 2018, a fast-moving wildfire, not unlike the explosive infernos we've seen in Oregon and California of late. And this fire, the Bald Mountain Fire of 2018, is one that nearly incinerated the community of Elk Ridge City in Utah. Defying all logic, the advancing fire unexpectedly stopped along an unnamed mountain barely 2 miles from homes and from evacuation routes. The mountain quickly earned the nickname Miracle Mountain by Utahns. Elk Ridge City was blessed, but elsewhere around the country, year after year, families are forced to evacuate their homes due to wildfire. As previously mentioned, better forest management can reduce the severity of wildfires and reduce the risk to fire-prone communities. We need a range of management tools to cut the red tape and curb frivolous litigation that has stalled fuel reduction projects and efforts to remove dead and dying trees from poorly managed federal land. It's timely today that we'll hear testimony on the Emergency Wildlife and Public Safety Act, a bill sponsored by Senator Feinstein and Senator Daines that proposes to accelerate wildfire prevention projects across the Cottonwood State. Senator Feinstein has joined us to provide a few brief remarks about her bill. Senator Udall and Senator Whitehouse will also be providing statements about their respective bills on today's agenda. And Chairman Murkowski will also join us to speak about her Alaska Native Claims Settlement amendments to expand services and resources for elderly Alaska tribal members. I look forward to hearing more about each of these bills and the other bills on today's agenda. With that, I'd like to turn to Senator Wyden, who's the ranking member on this committee, for his remarks. Senator Wyden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate your holding this hearing. I also note the presence of our chair, Senator Murkowski. One of the aspects of service I've most enjoyed was when I was chair and she was the ranking member, and we've continued those kinds of efforts in the years ahead. And I thank her for her courtesy this morning as well. What I can tell you, colleagues, is scores of fires have hit my state harder than a wrecking ball. Many of them are still going on. These are not your grandfather's fires. They are bigger, they're hotter, they're more dangerous, they're more powerful. I never conceived growing up of fires leaping over rivers, and we had fires in our part of the country who reduced whole neighborhoods to ash and actually melted cars. There's nothing left there of a car. I mean, just picture what it means to get so hot that you're just melting, automobiles. And there is a connection between fire and the bill that I've introduced, 2828, the Malheur Community Empowerment for the Oahe Act. This is extraordinarily important in rural Oregon, Malheur County, where the Oahe flows and the canyon attracts thousands of visitors each year, is actually the poorest in my state and one of the counties hardest hit by the coronavirus. The bill is about two things. It's about preserving ranching and the ag way of life as an economic engine, growing the local economic engine, and also protecting the absolutely gorgeous places that are part of this region. Just extraordinary. Now, I'm going to go into the bill just briefly in a moment. And I just want to come back to the relationship to the fires for just one moment. If the fires teach us anything, and the chair and I went through this morning because this is going to be a watershed moment with respect to this whole fire debate. If the fires teach us anything, it's that people who need jobs can and should be put to work restoring our public lands, preparing homes for fire resiliency, and shoring up rural communities against the encroachment of the pandemic. And this includes jobs for the restoration of 1 million acres of weed-infested public lands in Malheur County. And I really have appreciated the comments of my friend from Nevada over the years with respect to her public lands, because her public lands are a bit different than our public lands. But in both cases, we need to do a lot of restoration work, and we can put people to work, and we can spare ourselves catastrophes. And the only other point is the Senate, in working on these issues, has got to step up its pace. We talked about that this morning. So the Malheur bill. 2 years ago, a contingent of Malheur family ranchers came to D.C., and they asked for a meeting with me, and I was a little kind of slack-jawed because I was just stunned that they were coming to meet with me and ask to work with me on a big project. I was under the impression I would be probably the last person they would come and talk to. And I asked them why they were there in the office, and they didn't really say. And finally I said, I think you've come because you believe I'm the only one, Senator Murkowski, crazy enough to get in the middle of trying to work out an agreement that has been sought for decades in this part of the world between the ranchers and environmental folks and the like. And when I said it, they all pretty much smiled and said, yep, that's why we're here. We're here because we kind of think you're the only one crazy enough to be willing to try to get in the middle of this thing and try to sort it out. And it is a fabulous area. Senator Hindring, my great friend, knows a lot about it. And what I said when we started working on this, at that point, impossible undertaking, Senator Murkowski, you and I have been there before, is look, we're going to protect the ag way of life. We're not going to let anybody trample over the farmers and the ranchers and the ag way of life. But I also said we're not going to throw the environmental laws in the trash can. We're not going to just eviscerate the environmental laws. And everybody knew those priorities going forward. And there was widespread agreement about juniper and fire-prone weeds that were putting the lands at risk. We heard ranchers dealing with visitors would follow their GPS because it was risking their life to dangerous places. So we said we're going to have some loop roads to facilitate a safe visit to these wonderful sites without compromising them. And we went round and round, and we listened to scientists and educators and people who love the land and farmers, and we put pencil to paper. And the bill that we're hearing today represents the spirit of compromise. Nobody got everything they wanted, but everybody got something better than they have right now. And I would also tell my colleagues, from a historical standpoint, the Oahe isn't that far away from the area where we had the wildlife takeovers. So there's been some challenges in this part of the world, and I can't credit the Oahe community enough because they said, we're going to find some compromise. Nobody's going to get everything they wanted. The bill ensures land management can adapt to changing circumstances like climate change and drought by establishing new citizens-led communities to support transparent, real-time management of BLM lands. There's certainty for land users by setting a set of agreed-upon ranching and range improvement practices that are eligible for streamlined environmental review. The bill sets aside just over 1 million acres of land as wilderness, every acre of which was previously managed as wilderness, without the flexibility of rangeland improvements. We move away while protecting environmental laws from a full-blown NEPA analysis. If you're talking about moving irrigation trough away a bit from a river. And I'll just conclude by way of saying, now there are a lot of ranchers who say, this is something I can build my future around. This is an opportunity for my kids and my grandkids to have a future in the Oahe. And a lot of environmental folks have said that they can live with this bill, and neither side would have written it. And the last point I would make, because when I started on this legislation, the chair was very gracious, and I told her that this was really important to me in a personal way, because our staffer, Mary Gautreaux, who'd been with me for a quarter century, had been working on this for ages and ages. And when I went to visit her in her hospice bed, her whole wall was full of maps of the Oahe. The whole wall was filled with maps. She was talking to people and trying, that was what she stood for. And people would talk to her and she'd say, you know, Ron's just going to stay at this thing until he gets both sides together, the ranchers and environmentalists. And I said, no. If we get them together, it's going to be because of Mary Gautreaux. And I really want to get this bill passed, and we're all going to dedicate it to Mary. And Chair Murkowski, from the day that Mary passed, you've been in our corner on a lot of things. I just want to say thanks. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Wyden. We've got several members who have joined us to speak about their respective bills. So we'll start doing that. We're going to start with our chairman, Senator Murkowski, and then we'll go to Senator Manchin beyond that, and I'll outline the order from there. Thank you. Senator Murkowski.
Thank you, Chairman Lee. And I will be brief with my comments today because we do have a fair number, not only of those of us that are on the dais that have bills to speak to today, but we also have friends to the Energy Committee that are here to speak to their bills as well. I have one bill, a small bill that I want to speak to briefly, but before I do, I want to share my thoughts and prayers and really my sincere hope for rain and for recovery for so many who are facing the horrendous wildfires out west in Oregon, In Washington, of course, we're looking at it very carefully, and of course in California. To you, Senator Wyden, and to you, Senator Feinstein, you have my heartfelt condolences for the loss of life, loss of property, environmental damage that your states are enduring currently, and know that it's not just my thoughts that are reflected, but so many of us share in a real sense of loss for what you are experiencing right now. Right now, there are thousands of men and women that are working on these fires, bravely working on putting out these devastating fires. They're putting their lives at risk morning, noon, and night in the midst of a pandemic on top of all of this. And so our hearts and prayers are with them and with their family members. Alaskans are certainly thinking about them and hoping that they're safe, because we have a good group of Alaskans, some 400 plus, that are in your states, whether it's in California, Oregon, Colorado, they are around. We escaped some significant fires this year, and so I think you've got some folks that are fresh that have come to you. We've also sent assets, but knowing that we are in this fight with you is important to us as we keep you all in our prayers. I want to thank Mr. French and Ms. Castor for being here to provide testimony today, including on Senator Feinstein's bill that she has with Senator Daines, seeking to reduce the risk of wildfires and protect our communities. Senator Feinstein, you and I had an opportunity on the floor for me to thank you for your continued work on this. It's greatly appreciated. And to Senator Daines, when I know he's coming, thank him for his critical work on this very important issue. I want to acknowledge the work of my friend from Rhode Island on his Offshore Act. And he and I have had much time to speak about that, and we will do more on that. I also want to recognize, Mr. Chairman, that we have a former chair of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee here, Mary Landrieu's in the back. It's always good to see Mary and know that you're vigilant, you're staying on top of these issues, and we appreciate that. Ms. Castor, since you are here representing the Department of the Interior, I want to take just a quick moment to recognize and to congratulate the department on its recently completed review from the Office of Government Ethics. OGE took a look at the structural improvements the department has made to its ethics program, including additional training, new staff, and a consolidated, consistent approach across all of its bureaus and agencies. OGE found that all 14 of the recommendations from its last comprehensive review back in 2016 have been fully resolved. The agency offered no new findings or recommendations for improvements. That's something that I understand has never happened before at the department. In fact, it's rare across the whole of government. So I want to pass my appreciation on to Secretary Bernhardt, to Designated Agency Ethics Officer Heather Gautry, and to all in the department who have rebuilt its ethics program. I think OGE's report is a testament to this significant multi-year effort, and you're to be commended on this effort. Briefly, Mr. Chairman, here a few words about S2533. I've introduced this measure. It's very simple. It prevents Alaska Native elders from becoming ineligible for federal needs-based programs because of benefits that they receive from the Settlement Trust. This is authorized under the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. These settlement trusts are an important source of support for many elders who live in very remote, high-cost rural areas, but they do not displace the need for any federal support that combats the poverty and healthcare challenges these communities face. So I have a stack of letters of support for this bill that I would ask unanimous consent be included as part of the record.
Without objection.
And Mr. Chairman, I want to again thank you for holding this hearing. Lots of good bills on the agenda today. We also have more that we would like to hear before the end of the year. Senator Manchin and I have been talking about this. We'd hope we'd be able to schedule one more subcommittee hearing, likely early on in a lame duck, provided that we are able to do that. But I thank you for this very expeditious review of so many significant matters, and I thank the committee for its time.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We'll now turn to Senator Manchin.
Thank you, Chairman Lee, and thank you, Ranking Member Wyden, for convening a legislative hearing today, which is so important. I'm glad that my good friends, Senator Whitehouse, who we've had many conversations on, is here, and Senator Udall, I think, is here virtually, and of course, Senator Feinstein for being here. So we're so glad to have them. Also, it's good to see Senator Mary Landrieu, and a good friend of all of ours, but someone I enjoyed very much working with, and has been a dear friend with her and Frank and the family, so I appreciate her being here. The agenda before us today represents the priorities of many members of both sides of the aisle, including several members of the committee. As you know, many of these bills reflect years of work to get to this point, and I'm pleased to see them included in today's hearing. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the horrific wildfires that many of our western states are facing, and our heart goes out to each and every one of you and all your constituents in your states. It's just unbelievable. And this year, states throughout the West are experiencing an extraordinary number of very large wildfires called megafires that are each over 100,000 acres in size. These megafires require intensive staffing, but due to the COVID concerns at the beginning of the season, firefighters testing positive during the season, exhaustion, and the sheer size of these fires, staffing levels to fight these fires are far lower than normal and lower than where they need to be. I'm told that we need 5,000 firefighters to adequately be able to do the job that needs to be done. Given that 6 of the 20 largest wildfires in California's history are burning right now, in Senator Feinstein's home state, I look forward to hearing from her directly about the needs of the people in her state and how we can help. Immediate action is needed to respond to the ongoing fires. In addition, we all need to recognize that this is a perennial issue that is worsening every year. And so we need to be thinking of both short and long-term solutions to these wildfires. That includes securing additional firefighters, ensuring the necessary fire prevention work, like controlled burns to help prevent future large wildfires that gets underway. We must commit to taking the necessary proactive mitigation steps going forward. And furthermore, we need to ensure that the administration is using every tool that is already in the toolbox to provide assistance right now. We're not talking about next week or next month or next year, but right now. I stand by my Western colleagues and I'm ready to work with each of you. I'd also like to take a moment on Senator Whitehouse's Offshore Act, which would establish a revenue sharing model for offshore wind that varies slightly from the offshore revenue sharing model set up by the oil and gas in the Gulf of Mexico. His bill would create a dedicated revenue stream to invest in the protection of coastal communities, something that I know each and every one of us knows that he feels very, very passionate about, and rightfully so. We weren't able to consider his bill as part of the Great American Outdoors Act earlier this year, but I am glad that it is on our agenda today, and I look forward to hearing from Senator Whitehouse and learning more about this bill. With that, I thank you again, all my colleagues, for joining us and our witnesses for appearing before us today. Thank you, Chairman Lee.
Thank you, Senator Manchin. Okay, let me tell you where we're going to go next. We've now heard from the chair and ranking member of the subcommittee and of the committee as a whole. We're now going to hear alternating between Democrats and Republicans from members of the committee who want to speak briefly about legislation that we'll be discussing today. After that, we will hear from other members of the Senate who are not members of the committee, alternating between Democrats and Republicans. I think we've got all Democrats at this point, so you might have the run of show. Please signal to me if you're here, either virtually or in person, if you want to speak. But we've got Senator King, who's up to bat next. We will hear from him now, who's joining us virtually. Go ahead, Senator King.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this hearing. And I want to join all my colleagues in expressing my regret and sympathy and heartfelt wishes to the people of the West that are experiencing these terrible fires. Secondly, I want to add my voice to support Senator Whitehouse on the offshore bill. I think this is something that's going to be important for the country going forward, and using the analogy of the offshore oil industry and the revenues and the dedication of those revenues to coastal states that will be having some of the impacts, I think makes total sense. What I do want to speak about just for a couple of minutes, Mr. Chair, is S3366. This is a very simple bill that provides free park passes to Gold Star families. The sacrifice that have been made on behalf of this country by Gold Star families is almost unimaginable. And I think anything we can do to show our recognition of that sacrifice and our appreciation, we should do it. Basically, as I said, it's very simple. Free park passes, and it would be for family members, there would be a technique to allow them to identify themselves or to provide a document at the park, just as we now do for active duty military. And this is supported by the American Legion. It's supported by the various park supportive groups, by the VFW. This is a very strong bill, I believe. It's been introduced in the House. My co-sponsors on this side are Senator Daines and Senator Alexander. The good news is, from a budget point of view, the CBO says it does not score. The cost would be incidental and immeasurable, but the value to these families would also be immeasurable in a positive way. So, Mr. Chair, I appreciate your giving me time to say a few words. I think this is a bill that we can move and move expeditiously. And we have found during this epidemic that people really seriously value their time outdoors, and they value the great benefits that are provided by the experiences of our national parks and public lands. So I'll look forward to the consideration by the committee, and I appreciate the committee's taking up this bill today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you very much, Senator King. Any other members of the committee who are here who want to speak to a particular piece of legislation? Okay, I see Senator Heinrich and Senator Cortez Masto. Go ahead, Senator Heinrich.
Thank you, Chairman Lee, Ranking Member Wyden. Thank you for including two bills important to New Mexico on today's agenda. The MH Dutch Salmon Greater Gila Wild and Scenic Rivers Act would permanently protect some of the most dynamic and spectacular rivers and streams in our country. The Gila and San Francisco rivers are the beating heart of southwest New Mexico and are home to some of the most spectacular places in the West, full stop. This legislation is the result of many years of advocacy by community members who want to see their local rivers protected. And I was quite happy to join Senator Udall in both drafting and introducing this legislation in response to the overwhelming community support. We named the bill in honor of my friend Dutch Salmon, a writer, an angler, conservationist, and the Gila's most ardent defender who passed away last year. The Gila is wild and free today, undammed and undiverted, in no small part because of Dutch's decades and decades of work to keep it that way. This legislation will make sure that it will stay that way for generations to come. The second bill for New Mexico on today's agenda is a bill to designate Cerro de la Hoya as a wilderness area. Cerro de la Hoya, with a peak of nearly 10,000 feet, is the home of some of the best elk habitat in northern New Mexico. I know that because I hunted this unit just last fall. This legislation is supported by a wide range of community members, as well as the Taos County Commission and Taos Pueblo. Protecting this peak and its spectacular views has long been a priority for the Taos community, and I'm glad that this bill is moving forward today. Thank you to the witnesses testifying today, including both New Mexicans, and thank you, Chairman Lee and Ranking Member Wyden, for including these bills on the docket today.
Thank you. Senator Daines, were you wanting to speak on your legislation before we go to the witnesses? No. Okay, we'll hear from Senator Daines, then Senator Cortez Masto.
Yeah, well, I'm grateful that I'm here with Senator Feinstein today, as we have been working together on this important piece of legislation that addresses the issue of forest management and on being better stewards of our forests. As we say in Montana, either we're going to better manage our forests or our forests are going to manage us. And as we're seeing the raging wildfires in California, in Oregon, Washington, a lot of that smoke is coming into Montana, and we grieve for the people, with the people of California that have lost life, have lost structures, have lost habitat. So I'm grateful that we are here today to consider this piece of legislation. I'll just tell you, it's not too often that a Republican from Montana and a Democrat from California are locking arms here and join together to address an issue here to keep our communities safer through better forest management. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, the Ranking Member Wyden, for holding today's legislative hearing before the subcommittee. I appreciate you including my bill, S 2890, in the package today. The Douglas County Economic Development and Conservation Act is important for Nevada. This is truly a bill that not only is it important for the state, but the constituents. And I just thank everybody in the witness testimony today for the opportunity to have a discussion around this bill. I introduced this bill to promote conservation, to improve public lands management, and expand limited yet focused economic development opportunities for Douglas County, Nevada. The bill was developed in collaboration with local officials and includes the support of my Nevada colleague, Senator Jackie Rosen, and Congressman Mark Amodei in the House. This bill represents the Nevada style of legislating our local land management needs, as it is the culmination of a multi-year-long effort of people coming together and making compromise. It includes the support from local government, the business community, conservationists, and the Washoe tribe of Nevada and California. Before I go any further, let me just give you an idea of what, when I talk about Douglas County, what it involves. Douglas County is located in western Nevada. Within its boundaries are portions of Lake Tahoe, the Sierra Nevada mountain range, Topaz Lake, and the Carson and Walker rivers. These diverse landscapes draw outdoor enthusiasts from around the world. The county also contains the oldest permanent settlement in Nevada, cultural heritage sites, historical agricultural operations, I can't even say this, say this again? Thank you. Paleontological treasures and natural resources. It strives to cater to a growing annual visitorship while retaining its rural character. Douglas County's land base is 67.9% federal land that is administered by the BLM and the U.S. Forest Service. That's important. This is one of many of our counties where the federal government comes in and owns most of the land. Nearly 256,000 acres is managed by the federal government. These public lands provide a variety of popular recreational opportunities. These activities and the industries they support are critical to the economic prosperity of the county, employing 30% of the local workforce. In 2009 is when Douglas County started this comprehensive planning effort. And during that time, they incorporated the Washoe tribe of Nevada and California, federal agencies, state agencies, local towns, general improvement districts, and more than 90 stakeholder groups to facilitate the bill that is before you today. And so I am so pleased to be able to introduce this, knowing all of the work that has gone into this lands bill. Specifically, it conveys 67 acres to the state of Nevada to be managed within the Lake Tahoe State Park. It conveys over 7,000 acres to the county for local flood control management and recreation. It directs the sale of 60 acres whose revenue will fund and local conservation measures, conveys nearly 27 acres of important cultural sites to the Washoe tribe, and designates nearly 12,400 acres of wilderness. This bill has come a long way since 2009 when it was initially conceived, and although some issues still remain, many of the complicated issues have been resolved, and I look forward to working not only with our federal partners, who I know are committed to working with us on this bill, but all of my colleagues here to make sure that we can move this important piece of legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cortez Masto. We'll now be hearing from a number of our Senate colleagues, not members of the committee, who would like to make statements regarding their legislation. We'll hear first from Senator Feinstein.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Whoops, thank you very much. I want to, that she isn't here at the moment, but thank Chairman Murkowski for her words. Ranking Member Manchin, Subcommittee Chairman Lee, Ranking Member Wyden, and members of the committee. Thank you for moving so quickly on this bill. And I want to thank Senator Daines. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being a partner. It took a while to put this together, but we have it now, and I hope it can pass quickly. Let me be blunt. California is on fire. Smoke is blanketing the entire western part of the United States, and a good dose of it was here yesterday. California's traditional fire season has only just started, but 5 of California's largest fires in history have occurred this year. As I speak, 25 major fires are burning across nearly 2 million acres statewide. 25 Californians have died in these fires. 4,200 homes and structures have been destroyed, and more than 42,000 people have been evacuated. I think we have 90 pieces of equipment in the state today from other states. The largest fire in state history is now burning in the Mendocino National Forest. It's 875,000 acres. All told, 3.2 million have burned so far this year, the most in state history. And the same is happening across the West. 350,000 fires, as you pointed out, Senator Wyden, in Oregon, displacing more than 10% of your population. 300,000 acres have burned in Washington, 150,000 in Montana, and 100,000 in Colorado. We have to change our approach in dealing with wildfire and how we manage our forests. We can't just sit here and do nothing. Just as an aside, lightning is the source of these huge fires. And I've kind of decided I'm going to make lightning a pursuit and see what I can learn about it, what we might be able to do about it, if anything, because every year it becomes more and more a source of major fire in the state. That's why Senator Daines and I worked for months to draft the Bipartisan Emergency Wildfire and Public Safety Act to make some important changes that will help us cope with catastrophic wildfire. Our bill has the endorsement of California Governor Gavin Newsom, dozens of cities and counties in California, and numerous conservation organizations, fire districts, and utilities. And I would ask that a list of endorsers be placed in the hearing record, if I might. I'd like to
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like briefly just to explain 3 key provisions of the bill. We have to address the dead and dying trees in our forests that provide fuel for these disasters. There are more than 150 million dead trees in California's forests, the result of drought, bark beetle populations that thrive in warmer temperatures. Our bill creates a $100 million grant program and provides other incentives to help make harvesting dead trees more commercially viable, incentivizing businesses to step in and reduce the fuel load in our forests. Secondly, we need to increase the use of fire breaks and prescribed burns. Much like removing dead trees, fire breaks help slow fires and limit their spread. Our bill would allow for expedited environmental reviews regarding the installation of fire breaks near existing roads, trails, transmission lines, and pipelines. The bill also requires the Fire Service to consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service when new peer-reviewed research shows that a project could harm threatened or endangered species. As Senator Wyden has noticed, we must also increase the use of prescribed burns that help prevent forests from becoming overgrown and more susceptible to unstoppable fires. Our bill establishes a new prescribed fire center to coordinate research and training of foresters and forest managers in best practices. And third, we need to do more to help improve resiliency in fire-prone communities. Our bill expands a key program to aid the retrofit of homes with fireproofing materials to prevent the leveling of entire neighborhoods, as we saw in Paradise, California in 2018. I went up there, and I've never seen anything like it. When you see the expanse of fire and how the wind moves fire and how it'll catch one block in rural areas and then skip a block and then the next block and wipe out half of a commercial area. That's what happened in one of these huge fires in Paradise in 2018. We also promote the undergrounding of utility wires to prevent wildfires and the development of distributed energy, such as microgrids, to mitigate the impact of power shutoffs. Yes, climate change is making these fires worse by the year, and we've got to address it. Our bill takes aim at the direct, most immediate causes of this unprecedented series of wildfires, and I hope this committee will see fit to act swiftly to approve it for consideration by the full Senate. So, Mr. Chairman and members, thank you so much.
Thank you, Senator Feinstein. Senator Risch.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to make an opening statement. First of all, I want to say I appreciate the subcommittee chairman and subcommittee ranking member holding this hearing today. I was home in Idaho this past weekend, and I'll be headed back again this weekend. And it seems like all anyone can talk about is the smoke in the air and the wildfires causing it. What's unusual this time is it's not our smoke. It's coming from my good friends from the South and from the West, but we're living with it. And it's a big deal in Idaho, and Vicki and I are praying for the brave firefighters and fire crews battling these deadly places, and for the communities throughout Idaho and the West who are worried about losing their homes and their worldly possessions. We do have some fires burning in Idaho. They're not as extensive as they have been in years past. Certainly our hearts go out to the people in California and the other states that are having the larger fires. And it seems like it rotates from year to year. One year it's Washington, one year it's Idaho, one year it's Oregon, one year it's California. But it does seem to cycle around the states. Right now, there are more than a dozen fires burning thousands of acres throughout Idaho, and the vast majority of which are located on federal lands. Years of insufficient forest management have turned the West into a tinderbox. There are many factors that make wildfires spread, but regular fuel reduction is a critical and indisputable strategy to prevent wildfires of this magnitude, and particularly once they start from spreading. If we leave our forests unmanaged and our rangelands ungrazed, the health of the ecosystem deteriorates and their ability to host native plants and critical species diminishes. And when fire comes, it burns. That is something that we can unquestionably improve. I'm proud to co-sponsor the Emergency Wildfire and Public Safety Act and would like to thank my colleagues Senator Daines and Senator Feinstein for their leadership in introducing it. This bill offers common sense solutions to these common sense problems of improving our ability to reduce these fuels and improve our forest and protect communities in a productive and collaborative way. And I want to thank everyone that's involved in this effort. It is certainly a common sense effort and something that we can do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Risch. We'll now turn to my cousin, Senator Udall, who's joining us virtually.
Chairman Lee, thank you so much, and Ranking Member Wyden, and members of the subcommittee. And thank you for the opportunity to speak in support of S3670, the Dutch Salmon Greater Gila Wild and Scenic River Act. I know you have 16 bills on the agenda today, so I will be brief. This bill is named for Dutch salmon, a good friend of mine, a writer, a conservation advocate, who began championing the Gila River in the 1980s. After moving to the southwest New Mexico and falling in love with the Gila while hiking and canoeing it from its headwaters to Stafford, Arizona. Dutch was not the only one. The residents of southwest New Mexico and visitors from all around the country and the world love the Gila too. And Senator Heinrich and I have both spent time on the river and in the Gila wilderness, our nation's first wilderness. We've been working on this legislation for 2 years and introduced this bill at the urging of New Mexicans from all walks of life who also value this jewel of the Southwest. Senator Heinrich and I even took the unusual step of posting a discussion draft of the legislation earlier this year, which we revised to reflect community concerns. To those in support of the bill, we thank you. To those who still question the legislation, please know we heard you and made every attempt to address the concerns, all the concerns that we could. The Greater Gila watershed, including the San Francisco River and other main tributaries, comprises the largest remaining network of naturally flowing river segments in the southwestern United States. It provides unique and memorable outdoor experiences for families, spectacular scenery and wildlife habitat, and the foundation of a rural economy that includes farming, grazing, and recreation. Designating the river as wild and scenic will protect abundant cultural resources and the integrity of this important water source and existing traditional uses. To make sure future generations can enjoy the Gila like we and so many generations of New Mexicans have, we must take action to protect it, designating portions of the Gila River and its watershed as wild and scenic will protect one of the nation's most iconic and treasured river systems, as well as support the booming outdoor recreational industry in that part of the state and the agricultural economies that rely on it. Our bill takes pains to preserve both the river itself and existing uses along the river. This is a theme we heard consistently as we worked on the legislation. For the past 2 years, our staffs have met with local officials, soil and water conservation districts, farmers and ranchers, property owners, and folks who just like to spend time on the river. This took them to living rooms, conference rooms, city halls, and the spur-of-the-moment meetings with maps spread out on the tailgates of pickups. This bill provides involuntary condemnation of private property, which has never been a part of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, and preserves not only private property rights, but also water rights, existing irrigation and water delivery operations, grazing permits, public lands access, and future restoration projects. Thank you for including this important bill in today's hearing. I look forward to working with you to protect this critical watershed and the people whose lives and livelihoods depend upon it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Senator Udall. Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman Lee, and thank you also to Ranking Member Wyden for this subcommittee hearing. Thank you to Ranking Member Manchin and to our Chairman, Senator Murkowski, for their help with our Bipartisan Offshore Act. And finally, I want to thank Senator Cassidy, my partner in this bipartisan effort, for his important work. And also thank you to Chairman Wicker for joining as a co-sponsor. The reason for this bill is that coastal communities are getting walloped by frequent and severe storms, sea level rise, shifting fisheries, and all manner of conservation and infrastructure challenges. We see it right now on the Gulf Coast, walloped by Sally. Yet, per capita, coastal states receive substantially less federal preparedness and resiliency funding than inland states. 2 examples, the Land and Water Conservation Fund and the Army Corps' Flood and Coastal Storm Damage Reduction Fund. For LWCF, over the past decade, for every dollar that the fund sent to inland states per capita, coastal states got just 40 cents. And much of that in the coastal states was for inland and upland projects, not for their coasts. Over at the Army Corps, the so-called flood and coastal storm damage reduction fund has varied over the past 10 years between 19 times and 120 times more spent annually on inland work than on coastal work. 120 to 1 for a fund whose name has coastal in it. This persistent imbalance overlooks massive risks that coastal communities' infrastructure and economies now face. Just look at Freddie Mac's warnings of coastal property value crash, with estimates between $238 and $507 billion worth of coastal real estate submerged below sea level by 2100. And of course, the economic hits will come way sooner than the submergence. Economic hits will hit mortgage and insurance markets, Freddie warns, with, quote, economic losses and social disruption likely to be greater in total than those experienced in the housing crisis and Great Recession. And around the country, Moody's is revisiting coastal municipal bonds for this risk. So it's real, and the imbalance is real, and our bill helps remedy the imbalance with revenues from offshore wind and renewable energy development to support coastal states, provide resiliency and adaptation funding, and to boost coastal infrastructure. With Senator Cassidy, let me request that several documents, Mr. Chairman, be admitted as exhibits for the record, including support letters and other reports.
Without objection.
I close by thanking the members of this committee and subcommittee for their support and help, and I look forward to working with you to advance this bipartisan measure. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. Well, we've heard from two additional members who would like to put in a brief plug for the legislation before we introduce the witnesses. So we'll go next to Senator Daines and then Senator McSally, who's joining us via internet connection. Senator Daines.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I first want to begin by thanking the brave firefighters, smoke jumpers, pilots, and first responders in Montana and across the West for their ongoing heroism and sacrifice in battling the deadly wildfires ravaging the West. In fact, just last week, I visited the Bridger Foothills Fire. It's near my hometown of Bozeman. Destroyed 28 homes. I want to thank Gallatin County Sheriff Brian Gutkin and others for doing their part to ensure that no lives were lost during this tragedy. Their work saved lives. And before I begin, I'd ask that we might take a moment of silence in honor and remembrance of the over 35 individuals who have lost their lives this season, including Montana's Tom Duffy and Sarah Madsen, and the grieving American families who have lost loved ones, their homes, and their livelihoods in the wildfires. If you'd join me. Thank you. As we speak here today, hundreds of thousands of families have fled their homes as wildfires ravage over 6 million acres across the West. We've lost 35 lives, over 4,000 homes, and there's no end in sight. The impact these fires have in our rural communities will be felt for years to come, including our economy and our outdoor way of life. And the severity and intensity of wildfires we're witnessing can be attributed to multiple factors, including both a decline in forest management and warming temperatures. And while we can debate the extent to which different factors contribute to the wildfire activity, I think we can all agree the need for a bold, broad, bipartisan solution. The bill I've introduced with Senator Feinstein offers 53 pages worth of such solutions. We worked together on this for a year. And I want to thank Senator Feinstein for collaborating on this bipartisan bill, and she's been a strong partner on forestry issues. This bill has bipartisan support, both in the Senate and the House, and in the support of a broad array of stakeholders, including many conservation and environmental groups. It should come as no surprise as it takes critical steps to restoring the health of our forests and restoring good-paying timber jobs. I'd like to ask unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, to submit for the record 23 letters of support.
Without objection.
And I want to go ahead and debunk just a couple of the myths I've heard regarding this bipartisan bill. Some have said this legislation undermines environmental law and skirts judicial review. That couldn't be further from the truth. This bipartisan bill uses time-tested approaches to expedite and streamline critical projects without circumventing public input or environmental review. Bipartisan policies enacted in 2014 and 2018 serve as the foundation for these provisions, proving it is truly a bipartisan compromise. We're at a critical time. The West is burning. People are dying. The smoke literally starting to cover our country, and our way of life as we know it's in danger. We can't run to our corners. We can't continue to fall to partisan politics. It's a time to come together, Democrats and Republicans, and pass meaningful forestry reform. And this bipartisan bill does just that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator McSally.
Well, thank you, Chairman Lee, Ranking Member Wyden. Appreciate you convening this hearing on many important bills related to public lands, including my bill, S3427, Modernizing Access to Our Public Lands Act, and S4475, the La Paz County Solar Energy and Job Creation Act, which I'm leading with my colleague, Senator Sinema. Both of these bills will ensure that our public lands work better for our constituents. But because of the severity of the wildfires raging across the West, I do want to focus some of my time on this important topic as well. Arizona currently has 227 personnel deployed across the West, helping our neighbors battle the flames. The wildfire crisis is real, and it does require bold action from Congress to reduce hazardous fuels and improve the health of our forests. If we are serious about reducing the intensity and the severity of these wildfires, we need to focus on policies that actually improve the health of our forests. And that's exactly what I've done since I've been in the Senate. Last year, I introduced the Accelerating Forest Restoration Act with Senator Sinema to streamline the overly burdensome forestry regulations in the Southwest. And this will jumpstart the Forest Restoration Initiative, or FORFRI, in Arizona. While I'm glad to see the Forest Service adopt many of the proposals in my bill, more work needs to be done to make FORFRI a success and reduce the wildfire risk. Unfortunately, FORFRI has continued to encounter delay after delay. And even though this is the single most important project underway to reduce the risk of wildfire in Arizona, the Forest Service recently pushed back the phase 2 even further. This is unacceptable. We cannot afford to delay active forest management practices any longer. We must get projects like FORFRI out of the planning room and into the forest immediately. One of the biggest challenges we've had to forest restoration in Arizona is the crushing expense of harvesting and removing low-value biomass like branches, and undergrowth from the forest. That's why this week I'm introducing my bill, the Forest Health and Biomass Energy Act. My bill will accelerate forest restoration by reducing the cost and regulatory barriers to clearing out dangerous overgrowth and utilizing that material for carbon neutral biomass electricity. My bill complements the forest management policies included in the Emergency Wildfire and Public Safety Act, which I have co-sponsored with Senator Daines and we're considering in the hearing today. Together, our bills offer practical, cost-effective solutions to target the real root causes of these catastrophic wildfires while also supporting low-carbon energy. Again, I appreciate you having this hearing today. I look forward to moving these bills forward as well and bipartisan solutions to address the raging forest fires around the West and better management of our forest as quickly as possible. Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator McSally. Okay, it's now time for us to hear from our witnesses, who I will briefly introduce here in a moment. You may notice that some members will be filing in and out. They've called a vote, and members will be going in and out to vote, and I will have to do that at one point or another. But in the meantime, I'll introduce the witnesses. We have two witnesses joining us in person today. The first is Chris French, the Deputy Chief of the U.S. Forest Service. Welcome, sir. And the second is Amanda Castor, the Acting Assistant Secretary for Lands and Minerals at the U.S. Department of the Interior. Welcome, Ms. Castor. Joining us virtually are three witnesses. Mr. Mike Dunn, a representative of the Owyhee Basin Stewardship Council in Oregon, here to testify on S2828, the Malheur Community Empowerment for the Owyhee Act. Mr. Hayden Forward, board member of the Heritage Waters Coalition, New Mexico, who will testify on S-3670, the MH Dutch Salmon Greater Gila Wild and Scenic River Act, and Ms. Jamie Crockett, the co-owner of Gila Backcountry Services, New Mexico, who will testify on S-3670, the MH Dutch Salmon Greater Gila Wild and Scenic River Act. At the end of the witness testimony opening statements, members will be able to ask questions alternating between Republicans and Democrats. Your full written testimony will be made part of the official hearing record. Please keep your statements to 5 minutes so that we can have time for questions. We've also agreed to receive a written opening statement from Senator Cassidy, which will be admitted into the record without objection. Look forward to hearing from your testimony. Mr. French, we will start with you. Then we'll proceed through each of the 5 witnesses as you were introduced. Thank you, Mr. French.
Thank you, Chairman Lee and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I offer the U.S. Department of Agriculture view on the bills that are before you, and my complete testimony detailing the administration's position on each bill is included in the written record. Before I begin, I'd like to thank the subcommittee and all the senators for their support during this tragic fire season. With more than 31,000 interagency firefighters actively engaged, the entire interagency wildland fire effort is stretched to its limits, and the loss of life and homes and lasting effects to our communities, air quality, and the nation's natural resources continues an increasing trend that is unacceptable. The Forest Service is committed to keeping our communities and our firefighters safe. As for our firefighters, I've been in their shoes. I know their dedication, their bravery, and their professional integrity is second to none. Many lost their own homes as they helped to save the communities that they're a part of. So as we work without pause with our many partners to assist communities impacted by these fires, we are committed through shared stewardship to change the trend that is coming in the years to come. We're working with states, tribes, communities, and partners. We know that we can only change this by collaboratively working across boundaries on all lands to address our current wildfire reality. We have a nearly year-round season with ever-increasing catastrophic outcomes. We thank you for your continued focus and help. The authorities and capacity you've given us has helped us achieve our highest wildfire fuel reduction and prevention actions in more than 20 years. We're working really hard, but we know it's not nearly enough. The scale of our action must match the scale of our problem. And in places like California, it means treating 2 to 3 times more acres per year than our current efforts. This is our great challenge, and it affects all aspects of delivering our conservation mission. It dominates our work. We know a new paradigm has emerged. We know that we must scale our solutions, our resources, capacity, and resolve to create solutions that match these fires. And we look forward to your ideas and thinking to help us get through that. In relation to the bills at hand, the Big Bear Land Exchange Act would require a portion of the PCT to be relocated and a land exchange for a biomass utilization facility. We support the bill's goals, and we look forward to working with the sponsor as it goes forward. The Blackfoot Clearwater Stewardship Act directs the Secretary of Agriculture to develop a landscape assessment, restoration needs, and a schedule of restoration projects on the Lolo National Forest. It establishes 2 recreation management areas and additional acres as wilderness. We share Senator Tester's commitment to collaboration. We do have some concerns about the implementation of certain provisions, and we'd like to work with the subcommittee and the senator as this bill progresses. We support the Miracle Mountain Designation Act, which would designate a currently unnamed peak in Utah as Miracle Mountain following the events that occurred during the Bald Mountain fire, as Senator Lee talked about earlier. The MH Dutch Salmon Greater Gila Wild and Scenic River Act designates parts of the Gila River system as a wild and scenic river and transfers National Forest System lands to the Gila Cliff Dwellings Monument. The Forest Service is committed to collaborating during our current land management planning process to identify river sections for designation, and we look forward with the committee to ensure multiple uses are not affected. The Douglas County Economic Development and Conservation Act requires conveyance disposal, or congressionally directed special use permits of National Forest System lands in Douglas County. We look forward to working with the bill sponsor and the committee to address some of the technical issues as it moves forward. The Gold Star Families Parks Pass Act would make national parks and federal recreation lands pass free for Gold Star families. We support this bill to respect the ultimate sacrifice of our Gold Star families by allowing them to connect to our public lands, and we share the interest in recognizing their service and sacrifice that this bill is designed to honor. The Modernizing Access to Our Public Land Act directs the Forest Service to jointly develop and adopt interagency standards for outdoor recreation data. We support the goals of this bill and look forward to working with the committee. And finally, the Emergency Wildfire and Public Safety Act is a comprehensive bill designed to increase wildfire preparedness, post-fire response through a variety of measures, including a new statutory categorical exclusion, allowing for the export of unprocessed timber from dead and dying trees, and establishing a new landscape-level program for management activities designed to improve forest conditions. We very much appreciate Senator Feinstein and Senator Daines' attention to these important issues, and we support the intent and goals of the bill. Our written testimony offers several comments and observations meant to improve the language of the bill, and we look forward to working with this subcommittee as this moves forward. Thank you for your time today. That concludes my remarks, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. French. Ms. Castor.
Chairman, Ranking Member, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I am Amanda Castor, the Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for Land and Minerals Management at the Department of the Interior. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the legislation before us today. S-180 intends to streamline permitting processes where the federal government has less than a 50% mineral interest under non-federal surface ownership. We support these efforts to streamline administrative processes and reduce unnecessary procedural reviews. S-1295, the Federal Land Asset Inventory Reform Act, directs the department to develop a multi-purpose register of all federal real property assets and eliminate duplicative data systems across the federal government. The department is working to update and modernize our land ownership information systems, and we support the provisions of the bill that align with those efforts. S-2828, the Malheur Community Empowerment for the Oahe Act, directs the development of a programmatic EIS allowing for adaptive management of certain federal lands in Oregon. It would also designate 1.1 million acres of wilderness and approximately 15 miles of the Oahe River as wild and scenic. The department has concerns that designating wilderness areas outside of existing WSAs may not be the most appropriate land management tool, and that some of the provisions of the bill would launch potentially duplicative planning efforts. S-2890, the Douglas County Economic Development and Conservation Act, authorizes public land sales and conveyances in Nevada and provides for the transfer of public lands to be held in trust for the Washoe tribe. The bill also designates 12,000 acres of wilderness. We are committed to ensuring public access and support the goals of S-2890 that align with this important priority. The department remains concerned with the broad scope of the proposed land disposals, which are inconsistent with the administration's position in opposition of the wholesale disposal of lands. S-3241 proposes to amend Public Law 116-9 to establish the Cerro de la Hoya Wilderness in the Rio Grande del Norte National Monument in New Mexico. The department is concerned that the wilderness designation in the bill may be inconsistent with traditional uses such as grazing and collection of firewood and piñon nuts that are important to local communities. The department supports the goals of S-3366, Gold Star Families Parks Pass Act. This administration supports our military, veterans, and Gold Star families. The department believes free access to national parks and other federal lands should be extended to all veterans and Gold Star families. My father is a veteran, and I thank all those that have sacrificed for our country. S-3427, the Modernizing Access to Our Public Land Act, would direct the Department, Forest Service, and the Army Corps to collaborate on the collection, sharing, and publication of public lands recreation data. We believe that this bill has the potential to address some longstanding challenges surrounding public access and data management, and we look forward to working with the sponsor and the committee to address a number of technical issues. S-3485, the Offshore Act, would amend the National Oceans and Coastal Security Act and the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act to expand revenue sharing for offshore wind. The administration has made it a priority to boost domestic energy production while providing responsible stewardship of the environment and ensuring the taxpayers receive a fair return from the safe development of these public resources. S 4431, the Emergency Wildfire and Public Safety Act of 2020, seeks to reduce wildfire risk and improve forest management by establishing wildfire mitigation projects, providing expedited review of certain fuel break projects, promoting the development and use of biomass, and easing certain timber export restrictions. The department supports the goals of the bill and would like to work with the sponsors on certain critical improvements, including language to ensure DOI receives the same active management and wildfire risk reduction authorities under the bill that are provided to the Forest Service. Finally, S 4475, the La Paz County Solar Energy and Job Creation Act, would direct the department to convey approximately 4,800 acres of public lands to La Paz County, Arizona, with the intention of expanding a solar energy project. The department is focused on restoring collaboration and coordination with local communities to achieve this priority, and we support the goals of the bill that align with these priorities. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Castor. Okay, I'm going to run out and vote, but I want to set this in motion and keep it in motion. So we'll now hear from our three witnesses in the order in which they were introduced, from Mr. Dunn, Mr. Forward, and then Ms. Crockett. One of you can follow right after the other. Keep that going. Hopefully I'll be back by the time you're finished with those. I figure that's less inhumane than pausing the hearing and then making you come back. I'll be back momentarily. Mr. Dunn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Mark Dunn, and I represent the Owyhee Basin Stewardship Coalition. I'm here today to discuss S 2828. The OBSC is comprised of ranchers, hunters, recreationalists, and local business owners in Malheur County, Oregon. Malheur County, as Senator Wyden said, is the poorest county in Oregon in terms of economic activity. 72% of the area is federal public land. Agriculture is the sustaining enterprise in the region, with cattle ranching as a significant contributor to this activity. These family-based ranching operations are sustained through the use of permitted cattle grazing on public lands. For many years, this area has been embroiled in controversy as groups with differing points of view regarding how federal public land should be used became focused on the Owyhee Canyon lands. This has resulted in costly lawsuits and delays in important management issues. Most recently, those efforts revolved around an attempt to ask the president to create a national monument encompassing most of the public land in the county. OBSC was formed to prevent a monument from being designated. Once that perceived threat was temporarily removed, the coalition members decided that a proactive approach was better suited for the long-term benefit of the public federal land and also the community. We believe that a collaborative approach based on the health of the land and traditional land uses could create an environment whereby a long-term resolution to conflicts might be possible. In December of 2018, leadership from the Owyhee Basin Stewardship Coalition and I traveled to Washington, D.C. to meet with Senator Wyden and his staff. At that meeting, we asked Senator Wyden if he would be willing to lead an effort to bring various parties together to find a solution. We made clear that enhancing land health was the focus and our goal, and we're very grateful to Senator Wyden and his staff for agreeing to take on this challenging issue. Throughout 2019, Senator Wyden and his staff regularly met with representatives from the Owyhee Basin Stewardship Coalition and environmental groups with an interest in the area. Their tireless efforts, supported by Senator Merkley, are the reason this legislation is before you today. There are some areas in the bill where OBSC believes agreement was reached, but require more precise definition. In a perfect world, there are other language clarifications and enhancements that we would have preferred, and I'm happy to provide those to the committee separately. Let me proceed to summarize some of those specifics as follows. To start, over 2 million acres of public land in Malheur County are designated as either current wilderness study areas or lands with wilderness characteristics. As you may know, WSAs and LWCs are managed as de facto wilderness. This legislation creates slightly more than 1 million acres of wilderness while releasing over 1 million acres back to multiple use. OBSC feels this release language needs to be clarified in the bill. To continue, there are incredibly valuable precedent-setting aspects of this bill which could be used as a model in other areas of the Western United States. One of those is, given that the health of the land was the driving factor of the negotiations, the use of adaptive management tools on all federal public land designated or with administrative overlays in the county is invaluable. That will not only allow, but also require federal agencies to use best practices to maintain and improve land conditions. It will ensure seamless practices throughout the county in restoration and multiple use. Another precedent-setting aspect of the bill is the CEO committee, as Senator Wyden calls it. This allows the local community, as well as other interested parties, an opportunity to help direct priorities and management objectives with the focus on what's best to maintain land health. Since diverse groups have a seat at the table, we would appreciate clarification, providing additional oversight capabilities of the group. We would ask that this committee have authority and does not become simply another advisory committee that agencies can ignore. The legislation also provides various needed drivers of new economic activity for the county. It strives to enhance protections for sensitive ecosystem areas and allow for better access for visitors, campers, and sightseers where appropriate. We support those efforts. In conclusion, it was our members who derived their livelihood from these lands who asked Senator Wyden to undertake this process. We feel he and his staff have done an outstanding job, and we strongly support their efforts and are very grateful to him. Thank you for the opportunity to testify and for your consideration of this bill, which is critically important to all residents of Malheur County. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dunn. And I know our colleagues are in the middle of rotating in and out for voting, so I thank witnesses for their indulgence. And now we're going to hear from Mr. Hayden Forward.
Subcommittee Chairman Lee, Minority Leader, Senators, thank you for extending this privilege to speak with you today. I am Hayden Forward, a principal with the San Francisco Soil and Water Conservation District. And just for clarification, I need to make sure that everybody understands that's the San Francisco River watershed in New Mexico, and not to be confused with that beautiful city in California. I'm also speaking today on behalf of Heritage Waters Coalition, of which I'm a board member, and both agencies are in opposition of the Dutch Salmon Bill, S3670. I'd like to point out that since our conception in June of this year, 4 short months, Heritage Waters Coalition has absolutely been magnetic. In our short existence, we have gained 3,500 members with 4 local county commissions, 5 local governmental entities, and 39 New Mexico conservation districts, all opposing S3670 and the Wild and Scenic Rivers designation. The secret to our success is simple. We are balancing the scales and telling the risks that are associated with the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act and S 3670. Unfortunately, this legislation you're hearing today attempts to designate river segments where private lands and water developments lie within, above, and below proposed river segments. That's important. I'm going to bring this up a number of times. Private property that is above and below designated river segments. These private properties have water diversions, wells, crossings, right-of-ways, livestock use, and other utilizations of these river segments that make them inherently incompatible with Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. I want you to consider for a moment a checkerboard pattern. And this is established between the designated rivers and the private lands that I'm talking about above and below. You will have a designation of a river coming down, jumping over private property, designation river, leaping private property again. And it almost reaches absurdity. I will use an example of Mineral Creek designation, where they have divided up small segments as small as 0.02 tenths of a mile, 0.03 tenths of a mile. I have one segment here that is 1/10 of a mile. So these short river segments are not in line with the spirit and the meaning of a free-flowing, wild and scenic river. Little bit of history. In 2002, the Gila National Forest Plan recommended 9 river segments for designation as wild and scenic. All were within the designated wilderness areas. The legislation that you're looking at today has designated an additional 51 river segments that, this is important, that were deemed ineligible in 2002. The diverse group that was associated with the review of designation saw nothing outstandingly remarkable in these 52 river segments that are now being designated. So the rivers haven't changed. Something else has changed here. The proposed legislation also ignores National Environmental Protection Act, NEPA. Additionally, 3670 ignores any evaluation of economic impacts. It ignores the public comments because none of the opposing public comments that were shared are reflected in this new legislation. So it certainly is not taking into full consideration all the people that live and work along the river. So speaking of those people, the population, let's recognize for a minute the partnership that has lasted for years between the USDA and the NRCS. These are farmers, ranchers, allotment holders who have spent in-kind millions of dollars of money to do good conservation on the river. Section 7 of Wild and Scenic Rivers Act takes control of state and local government and overlays federal law, meaning all the traditional government agencies that were doing good conservation on the river are now out and federal laws taking place. I will move along here quickly. The bill will no longer balance good conservation and water use within the Gila watershed, and it'll move towards full protection of the river, eliminating 134 years of economic growth and rights along the river. We need to understand that the secretary or custodian in charge will have the powers to allow for any conservation work to be done on the river. He will be using a written management plan that will be written to minimize the use of waters to the maximum extent. One more comment. Let's talk about jobs for just a moment. Some of our nation's largest mining operations or organizations have operations in southwest New Mexico. Grant County, GDP, 40% of their GDP is mining. These operations do indeed have diversions in the rivers, which were placed under full NEPA protection. Should maintenance be required, The permitting would be placed in the hands of the secretary in charge, who would have the ability to stop maintenance on the diversion, shut down the mine, and demolish 44% of Grant County's economy. I think that would be absolutely devastating. Forgive me for going long, and I will look forward to any questions.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Ford. And now we'd like to turn to Jamie Crockett, our last witness. Thank you for being here virtually.
Chairman Lee, Ranking Member Wyden, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to testify before you today in regard to S 3670. As introduced by Senator Tom Udall and co-sponsored by Senator Martin Heinrich, this legislation seeks to permanently protect close to 450 river miles of the most outstanding rivers in New Mexico as wild and scenic rivers. My name is Jamie Crockett, and I am a property owner in a rural community on the river in the middle of the Gila Wilderness, where my husband and I own and run Gila Backcountry Services, an outfitting business permitted by the U.S. Forest Service. We run multi-day mule packing, naturalist guiding, and boating trips throughout the Gila National Forest for hunters, fishermen, biologists, trail crews, horseback riders, and birders. Our week-long rafting expeditions go through the incredibly beautiful main canyon of the Gila River in the Gila Wilderness. We've been privileged to spend the last 15 years in these incredible canyons. These places are important to my family because they are our home and our livelihood. New Mexicans travel great distances to get to the water's edge. It's where we connect with family and friends. It's where we escape the summer heat in the cool, clear water. And it's where we raise our children to respect nature, God, and each other. These intrinsic values are our way of life, and they're the reason why I live here, and it's why this area is a destination. Tourism is the second largest industry in our state, and outdoor recreation is one of the fastest growing sectors here. Tourism in Silver City is on the rise, and I expect the wild and scenic designation will increase the draw to this area and will continue to sustain this growth in a healthy way that respects our local traditions. This bill is the result of a grassroots movement and nearly a decade of work from and by the people of my community to guarantee protections of these rivers, their values, their current uses, and our traditional ways of life. The vast majority of residents in the Gila region support wild and scenic rivers, and I know this personally from doing community outreach and getting signatures from over 150 local businesses, in attending meetings with our fellow constituents and talking with my neighbors. As a community, we asked Senator Udall and Senator Heinrich to write this important bill for our river. And Senator Udall and Senator Heinrich took great care in taking multiple meetings with community members that represent a variety of opinions on the subject. I was present at one meeting where Senator Heinrich generously listened to stakeholders on all sides of the political spectrum, including parties concerned about how this may affect their water rights and ranching traditions. And I saw firsthand how our senators cared about those concerns and have done the work necessary to ensure that everyone involved has been acknowledged and accounted for in the text of the bill. This bill has received broad support from a wide variety of community organizations like the Fort Sill Apache Tribe and the All Pueblo Council of Governors. Also, the local towns of Hurley, Baird, and Silver City have passed resolutions of support, as has the Grant County Commission. There's been formal support from sportsmen and women's organizations, veterans groups, faith leaders, and civic groups like LULAC. In the American West, we measure our wealth in water. So while Southwest New Mexico isn't dominated by wealth in a traditional sense, We are the heirs of an incredible fortune by way of this free-flowing gem of the Gila River. We carry the honor and the burden of protecting the river and its traditional uses indefinitely through this important legislation. S3670 has been a community-driven effort involving years of outreach and education among diverse interests, and we're thankful that the senators worked with us to introduce this legislation in the United States Senate. On behalf of the many, many local area farmers, ranchers, hunters, anglers, private landowners, recreationists, business owners, tribes, and elected officials, I wish to convey our collective view that it is vitally important to protect these critical watersheds and rivers by designating certain segments of the Gila River for inclusion in the National Wild and Scenic River System. I encourage the committee to proceed with expedited consideration and approval of the MH Dutch Salmon Greater Gila Wild and Scenic River Act. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee for your time and consideration. This concludes my testimony, and I'd be happy to answer questions.
Well, thank you, Ms. Crockett. You certainly have enticed me to look more into this legislation and want to visit the Gila River area. And so thank you for being part of this testimony today. Again, we're waiting members to return from votes, and fortunate for me, I was high on the list anyway, so I'm going to go and ask my questions. I'm going to start, if I could, with first a fire picture as I talk about our state. This is a picture from Yakima, Washington, but we are at over 600,000 acres burned, with 300,000 of those acres burning in just one day. This isn't a new story to us. We obviously have been through this very intense fire years for several years in a row. And as Senator Feinstein started talking about what's going on in California today, when people start saying this is the biggest fire ever in the history of our state, that's where we were several years ago. So that's what's happening, record fire seasons. The second chart I'd like to put up, because in response to these, we have passed new fire legislation and obviously trying to give the Forest Service, Vicki Christensen and you, Deputy French, the tools that you need to help fight the fires. And one of the things that we did was give the tools of smoke forecasters. Why did we do this? Well, we knew that the fire season was going to bring these very daunting health situations. So as you can see on this color-coded map of Puget Sound here, we might want to bring it a teeny bit closer, but these colors are showing us, and this is the help of getting this forecast information, that you can see these very deep colors of red and are purple and very dark colors are showing that you either have a big part of Puget Sound and a big part of our state and on into Oregon and a little bit into Idaho, either basically either unhealthy, very unhealthy, or hazardous. So basically, all of this area there in the purplish color is basically unacceptable health risks with smoke. So I wanted to ask you, Deputy French, how has this helped us in understanding the risk of the fire season and giving us information with these forecasters to communicate to the public and to the firefighting community what we need to do to take care during this process?
Thank you, Senator. It's been a great help. The Department of Agriculture and Department of Interior have been using many of the aspects that came out of the law to really focus on how we use technology differently. So you talked about one. In terms of air quality, what sort of changes do we need to make in terms of movements of people? Where do we need to put resources? Those sorts of things. We've also been working very much on ground-based image technology to understand where we're seeing shifts and changes in fires and where to put resources associated with that. We have an RC-26 aircraft that has a distributed real-time infrared capability that's from the 141st Air Refueling Wing up on the Washington Air National Guard. And that's been deployed in support of wildland fire operation to provide a number of these services. We're on track right now for awarding a contract for location services for wildland firefighters. And we're also using the some of the technology advances for our smoke jumpers to be able to drop things into areas more precisely than we've done before. And all that has come out of the focus that came from the passage of that bill.
Well, that's great to hear because we felt like we needed more data. I don't think anybody in Puget Sound's confused when they look outside. They don't think it's healthy. But what this really has done is help us with the information about the level of severity of the smoke, is what you're saying, and then helping us move the resources in the right places based on that information.
And it helps us understand the effects as well. I think we all knew, I mean, we saw the smoke in the air, but we didn't know necessarily where the intensity was and that sort of thing. So it's all around, it's helped us both in the thinking about where we need to do preventative work, but also how to manage things once some of the fires begin.
Well, where can we take this going forward? Because I certainly believe on the prescribed burn side, you know, we were a fan of changing it. People said, oh, you can't change this from a seasonal perspective. People don't want to have smoke in March. Well, I guarantee you on a prescribed burn, they'd rather have smoke in March than a whole week or a whole month of forecast smoke. So how can this now help us have a regional conversation about prescribed burn and things like the Pine Pilot that were basically, you know, now more of a global discussion about how to use those tools?
Yeah, thank you. So I think people are understanding that in these fire-prone forests that one of the main things we need to do as part of our active management is bring in more prescribed fire, reintroduce fire into these places. And if we can have the predictive services to understand what the smoke impacts will be, we can educate folks, we can make changes to how we're doing things, pick the right times of year to do that, and get that work done more effectively. That's the part of it I think that's been most exciting.
Thank you. Well, and so basically you're saying predictive services like these that we put into previous fire bills now can help us target prescribed burns. And then to the ranking member's comment about 5,000 firefighters needed right now, do you agree with that number?
You know, honestly, I don't know what the exact number would be. I can tell you that we have more than 31,000 firefighters deployed right now. We've had a pretty sustained effort in the interagency response through the entire year. And even with COVID, we were managing that very well. This last weeks have really shown, though, the stresses in the system. But I don't know the exact number.
Well, I see the chairman has returned. I appreciate it. I thank you for your testimony. I would say I hope that we all will look for more support of firefighting with the range protection organizations, with international countries who haven't helped us. And we need to be aggressive about getting more resources. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator.
Thanks, Senator Cantwell. Mr. French, in my opening statement, I talked about the Bald Mountain Fire in the UN National Forest that nearly reached the community of Elk Ridge City, Utah. For the record, what do you think could have happened had the fire advanced just a few more miles, had it not been for Miracle Mountain?
So I'll be thoughtful in my response only because there is some ongoing litigation associated with that response. But as we have seen in many places, often the difference between catastrophic impacts to communities and a fire not having that can be based on very quick changes in weather events and other events, and the potential is huge. We see that play out time after time in many of these fires, that we can see singular things like just happened last week where we had these wind events. Where suddenly something that would appear to be normal and something that is manageable under normal circumstances can absolutely change overnight, and 1 million acres are burned within days.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And it really was an awful fire. It could have been so much worse, and we were grateful that it turned out the way that it did. Ms. Castor, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about S-2828. The Malheur Community Empowerment for the Owyhee Act. We'd love to get some clarification on the lands intended for multiple use management under this bill. The bill, as I understand it, would designate about 1 million acres of wilderness while releasing another 1 million acres that currently are managed as wilderness study areas and lands with wilderness characteristics. Tell us, what are lands with wilderness characteristics?
So, Senator, lands with wilderness characteristics are inventoried by the Bureau of Land Management during the land use planning process, also the resource management planning process. And they will inventory those LWCs and then work through the public process to identify and determine how best to manage those characteristics.
And if Congress were to release these lands within wilderness characteristics under the bill, would they continue to be managed under the BLM resource management plans and potentially with wilderness character or some similar restriction?
To the best of my knowledge, yes. So it would be really contingent on that land use planning process that the BLM employs.
Now, the bill proposes that we convert 2 BLM grazing allotments into land held in trust by the Secretary for the Burns Paiute tribe. Is that right?
Yes, to my knowledge.
Now, we understand that the tribe currently holds the grazing permits to those allotments and then subleases to other ranchers in the area. Are there any land uses or access issues that arise in the conversion of these lands?
Not that I'm aware of, but I think one thing we'd like to further explore, Secretarial Order 3373, requires the Bureau of Land Management to assess recreational values. And I think that would be a key thing to assess across the board with these actions proposed in legislation.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd appreciate anything you could do to help us look into that and help us understand that point. We've been told by Representative Walden from Oregon's 2nd Congressional District, that some local ranchers and sportsmen may have some concerns about that provision. So I'd love to find out more about that if you've got anything. Mr. French, let's go back to you for a minute. On the Blackfoot Clearwater Stewardship Act, as 1735, like the bill we were discussing just a moment ago, the Blackfoot Clearwater Stewardship Act is another bill that purports to sort of split the baby, for lack of a better word, on wilderness for multiple use land. The bill would designate about 80,000 acres of wilderness in Montana's Lolo National Forest while setting aside about 2,300 acres for 2 recreation management areas intended to be of benefit to the area's snowmobile users. Now, the Montana Snowmobile Association contacted the subcommittee to warn us that some of the lands in these recreation management areas have elevated the avalanche potential in the area. Is that something you can confirm or dispute?
I can't confirm or dispute it. We've heard the same information. I've asked our folks in the area about whether or not there is an increased potential, and what they've basically said is any backcountry areas like that for snowmobiling, there is increased potential depending on different snow loads.
Okay, but they didn't identify anything beyond that, anything specific to these circumstances?
Not that I had in time for this hearing.
Okay. Also, does this bill release any wilderness study areas?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. All right. We'll ask some additional questions in any subsequent round. Next up to bat will be Senator Stabenow, who joins us online. Go ahead, Senator Stabenow.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to all of our witnesses and, of course, our ranking member. And thank you for all of the legislation that's in front of the subcommittee. My first comment is just that my heart goes out, like all of ours does, to those who are impacted.
We lost your audio feed there. Debbie, if you can push the...
Yep.
Oh, there we go. Wait, you're back. Thank you. Wait, you were saying something very profound and we lost you for a second, so we're glad to have you back. Okay, we appear to have an interrupted internet connection there. Okay, I can see her again.
Hello?
There we go.
Okay, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you intermittently. We can see you, and we can hear a few words out of every sentence.
And here.
It's a good idea.
To the entire hearing, so I'm not sure what the problem is.
Okay. Senator Stabenow, if Senator Cortez Masto raised a good suggestion, try turning your video feed off, and let's try to do this through an audio connection only, because right now we're getting only broken pieces of both your video and your audio feed. Let's try that and see if that works. Okay.
Hello?
Okay, that's better. I can hear you now. We don't see you, but Senator Cortez Masto's suggestion appears to have worked. Go ahead.
All right, well, thank you so much. It's interesting that, I'm sorry that this is not a good connection, but as I was indicating, Mr. Chairman, thank you to you and the ranking member. And first, my heart goes out to everyone affected by the horrific fires. And a huge thank you to all the firefighters and others who are really heroes in this battle against the fires. And I really want to speak in part as the ranking member of the Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry Committee, which is the other committee of jurisdiction on so many of these issues. And thank you to Mr. French and the Fire Service and everyone who's working so hard. But I think it's important to step back a moment and realize that in congressional testimony, time and time again, experts really have been pointing to two things to address these fires. One is what's happening on the climate crisis, and the other is a lack of resources to manage and restore our forests. And these are key drivers of today's wildfire issues. So this is not about environmental protection laws, it's about resources, it's about fire management. And that's why so many of us worked together to broker the bipartisan Forest Service budget fix in 2018 to free up the necessary dollars to undertake science-based restoration of our forests. And so we freed up about a little over $500 million that we thought was going to go back into funding prescribed burns, Mr. Chairman, as you talked about, which are possible now if the resources are there and so on, the coordination. But instead, what we saw, instead of the savings being used to decrease wildlife risks, the Trump administration cut the Forest Service budget. And in every single submission they have made to Congress, which is deeply concerning to me. And it's also important to really focus on the fact that if we had the resources, the fact is that it's important to emphasize that the Forest Service already has over 30 categorical exclusions from the National Environmental Protection Act at their disposal, including 3 new major exclusions that we authorized in the last 6 years from the 2014 Farm Bill, 2018 Omnibus package, and the 2018 Farm Bill. So I am truly concerned and don't understand why the administration is not fully implementing the new restoration tools we've already given them. And so just one example and then a question to Mr. French. In the 2018 Farm Bill, we reauthorized and doubled the funding for the popular Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program. The Forest Service own website says this program has proven to be an effective tool for improving forest conditions. And yet the administration has proposed to zero out the program. in every single one of its budgets. So, Mr. French, again, thank you for your service and everyone who you represent. And we all agree we need to do more on forest management. But after working on these issues for a lot of years and trying to give you more tools to do that, so why not fund and prioritize the programs Congress has already given you to do what needs to be done, what I know you want to do?
Thank you, Senator. So the wildland fire funding fix was a game changer for the agency, and it went into effect this year. And, you know, the biggest benefit right now that we're seeing is we're not having to do those mid-year transfers to help pay for our suppression activities. That's given a lot more consistency to our ability to do work. We have really emphasized the use of the tools that Congress has given us, including those CEs that you talked about. We had a concerted national effort across the agency to use those in a broad way. The reality is that if, you know, the average environmental assessment we do in the agency, you know, takes for a fuels project takes somewhere around, you know, 685 days. Whereas when we went to one of the new authorities and CEs that Congress gave us, it's around 243 days. I think that the biggest issue we're running into now is just a matter of scale. The types of fires we're seeing, these mega fires in the hundreds of thousands of acres, the types of active management we need to do on the ground, the tools we have need to match the scales of the fires that we're seeing. And so we've really dedicated tremendous amounts of the agency just to this work. But that's the challenge that we're facing right now. And we're really grateful to the efficiencies that Congress has given us. I think it's why you're seeing the highest outputs that we've been able to achieve. I just know that we need to do a lot more.
So just one follow-up, Mr. Chairman, as Mr. French, so when you talk about scaling it up, is this an issue of providing more resources, funding to be able to do that?
In order to do more acres, we need to have the resources that meet those acres. It takes wildlife surveys, it takes vegetation surveys, it takes the compliance to do through NEPA, the contracts to do the fuels work or the timber removal work. It's all of the above. And so we use every resource we have right now towards that priority.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm so sorry for the technical difficulties.
Oh, no worries at all. It was worth the wait. And we have Senator Cortez Masto to thank for, we'll have to refer to her as our tech expert
Only goes so far
on the committee now. Senator Cortez Masto, you're next.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me have bounce back here to S2890. And this is the Douglas County bill. And thank you both. I know you've been working with us, and I appreciate there's still some things we have to work through. But Ms. Castor, if I could start with you, you made a comment that there's many provisions within the bill that you support, but there is a concern about the transfer of public land that doesn't, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you said that doesn't comport with the administration's position on wholesale disposal of lands. Is that right?
That's correct.
And what does that mean, the administration's? And who are you referring to when you talk about the administration?
Senator, I'm referring to the president and the secretary. But that said, you know, we would be interested in working with you on this legislation. We appreciate the fact that Douglas County has unique recreational opportunities. And one of Secretary Bernhardt's first secretarial orders he signed, SO 3373, contemplates land tenure actions and recreational opportunities. And so we'd like to ensure, as the legislation moves forward, that those key recreational opportunities and access are not impacted moving forward.
Okay. And absolutely want to talk with you, because I think in question here is just about 7,000 acres of BLM managed land, which Douglas County is looking for 5,000 of that to be in their control so they can manage the flood control piece of that for flood control management. And then the other 2,000 would be used for recreation purposes. Is that something different? Are you hearing something different than that?
So I believe, and you can correct me, Senator, that the conveyance would be as part of an RMPP, And typically the acreage of an RMPP is not that high. So we can work with you on additional options for how best to facilitate how to deal with that language moving forward.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And then, Mr. French, let me ask you this. In your testimony, in your notes, you have concern with a particular parcel that has been identified for potential disposal that is adjacent to the Forest Service's Plymouth Interagency Work Center. And that is an administrative site that holds the firefighter barracks, a management office, and other facilities. I understand that the Forest Service completed a NEPA review for additional administrative facilities at that site and the parcel of interest back in 2010. And so I guess my question to you is, are you looking to then move forward with development on that site? Or can you give me an update so that I can relay to Douglas County what the intent is with that site that we're trying to get transferred?
Yeah, I mean, this is actually a pretty simple one. It's not that we're opposed to that sort of exchange. It's just that particular one, we put a lot of investment in for the expansion of our facilities. I think, as you know, we have a huge deferred maintenance backlog in the agency, and we have strategies in place of how to reduce that. And so the forest supervisor out there, Bill Dunkenberger, has worked hard to try to figure out how do you consolidate some of that. That was part of that broader plan, to use that site to consolidate other units to save the agency money over time. We certainly would work with the county and the community on finding alternatives to that. But, you know, if that's the way it goes, we just want to make clear that, you know, we put considerable investment into.
Yeah, and I that's what I'm hearing. So, and it sounds like, correct me if I'm wrong, you've got to make priority decisions based on funding resources, and this hasn't been at the top because you've had the backlog to address. Yep. Is that right?
Yep.
So now that we have passed legislation to address the backlog and appropriately fund it, hopefully this goes back to the priority list to address this parcel and what you're going to do with it. Is that possible?
Yeah, fair point. I mean, I think you're referring to the Great American Outdoors Act, and one of the things the Great American Outdoors Act does for us is it allows us to use our other appropriations that would be used for things like this and in addressing some of those issues. So fair enough.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for being here today. We really appreciate it.
Mr. French, as I'm sure you're aware, there are some, as we've discussed today, some really ugly fires raging in the West, due in part to poor federal land management. I noticed that S 1765 contains provisions that can be read to prohibit timber harvesting in certain areas. You'd think that without such harvesting and maintenance at these recreation areas might actually have a tendency to become more prone to catastrophic wildfire. Even though I know that's not the intent, I don't think anyone would want to do something that leaves these lands more subject to catastrophic wildfire, but could it have that effect?
I think in general, anytime that tools are taken out of our toolbox for addressing our ability for reducing wildfire risk, it just makes it harder to deal with. I always appreciate when we create areas or designate areas that have outcome-based type standards, and then we can use the different tools to meet those outcomes. But I think, you know, that's one of the things that are one of our lessons learned over years, is that as we're trying to figure out how to actually reduce that risk, whether it's through active management of prescribed fire, reducing fuels, that we need every tool in the toolbox, especially because when you're dealing with fuels reduction, there's not a market for it most of the time. You're usually paying for it in other ways, maybe through commercial timber.
Okay. But typically that should be something that we should look out for, though, right? If we are, anytime we take a parcel of federal land and we tell the government, we tell the land management agencies that they can't harvest, or we take off the table certain activities that would involve either creating fire breaks, removing snags, or otherwise, that does almost inevitably increase the wildfire risk, right?
Our position for years on all designated areas is to allow the full set of tools for accomplishing the goals of what that designated area was meant to be.
Okay. Thank you. That's helpful. Let's get back to, this will be for Mr. Forward. Talking about S3670, this legislation proposes to designate more than 30 segments of Forest Service land in New Mexico under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, totaling more than 440 miles. Wild and Scenic River designations don't just affect rivers and streams, they also extend wilderness restrictions up to 1/2 mile from the stream's high water mark. How, Mr. Forward, will this bill affect water access and not just water rights for irrigation and for livestock growers?
Thank you for the question. The primary concern is that the dozens of diversions that are currently on the San Francisco and the Gila River do require maintenance from time to time. With the overlay of federal law and a custodian that is in charge of permitting, he will have every right based on the river management plan to deny permits to maintain diversions. And he may have many different reasons to deny permits. Who knows, silt perhaps going down the water, or it may change the visual of an outstanding, remarkable feature. So it could effectively shut down irrigation and it in fact forced abandonment of water rights if they cannot continue to maintain their diversions.
Mr. Dunn, if this, go ahead. Mr. Dunn, if this legislation is enacted, do you think there is still a threat of a monument being designated?
Obviously, that would depend on the president and whoever that might be at the time. I think it's unlikely that having gone through this process and negotiated an agreement with all sides, that a monument would be declared. I think they'd give us an opportunity to make sure that this works, and that's certainly what we're hoping for.
Ms. Castor, in your testimony, you mentioned that S2828 may include some lands that may not be appropriate for wilderness designation. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Happy to. So, Senator Lee, I think you captured it really well in your questions to Mr. French. When you look at parcels of land and then decide how to manage them and kind of remove that multiple use overlay, that does have an impact on the agency. And so we'd like to ensure that that is the best use of the land. And given the ongoing fire activity out west, you know, the Bureau of Land Management, the Department of the Interior would like all of its multiple use resources available to be able to combat fire.
Thank you. Okay, so Senator Hogan has now joined us. Senator Hogan, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. Also, thanks to Ranking Member Wyden and to the witnesses for being here. Before the committee today is S-180, the Bureau of Land Management BLM Mineral Spacing Act, legislation I've been working on now for a number of years, and I appreciate Chairman Lee joining me as an original co-sponsor of the legislation. The legislation would streamline and approve the permitting process for energy development by lifting the requirement for a federal permit when less than 50% of the subsurface minerals are owned or held in trust by the federal government, and there's no federal surface land ownership. And so I appreciate Chairman Lee, you having this on the docket today, and I'm hopeful we can advance the bill, which I think is important for continued energy development for our country. And so let me start with you, Ms. Castor. Appreciate the Interior Department's supportive testimony on the legislation. Thank you for that. And my question is, would you agree that this practice of getting that the requirement now that we get multiple overlapping permits, especially when BLM owns a minority interest in the mineral acres and a spacing unit has no surface acreage, is an overly burdensome process?
Thank you, Senator Hogan. We believe that streamlining the permitting processes where the federal government has a less than 50% mineral interest under non-federal surface ownership reduces unnecessary procedural reviews, which allows to address the backlog at a faster rate.
Under my legislation, energy developers would still be subject to all state laws, regulations, and guidance governing energy activity in each relevant jurisdiction. You believe that our legislation would ensure adequate environmental and safety review, particularly if operators submit state-approved drilling permits to the BLM, as you suggest in your testimony?
Generally, yes, Senator.
Okay. Now, a typical spacing unit is 1,280 acres. In North Dakota, there are about, almost 3,000 spacing units with a small percentage of federal minerals. That means over 3 million acres are not being developed because they contain, these federal minerals. Would you agree that my legislation would be a benefit to the taxpayer by making more areas available to lease and opening new energy development opportunities?
Yes, we agree, Senator.
All right. Deputy Chief French, would you agree that redundancies in permitting which do not lead to greater safety or better environmental stewardship are hindering the multiple use mission of the Forest Service or its forest lands and grasslands?
Yeah, we have number of cases where we can see where that redundancy is affecting our efficiency.
Okay. And will you continue to engage with stakeholders in North Dakota, as well as my office, as you move forward with your final management plan?
We certainly will, Senator.
Okay. Again, I want to thank both of you, and I want to thank the chairman and the ranking member for holding this hearing today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Senator.
Thanks, Senator Hogan. Okay, I've got a few more questions, if that's all right. On agenda item 3366, the Gold Star Families Parks Act, I've got a question for Ms. Castor and Mr. French. Approximately how many families you think would be eligible for passes under this legislation? Do you have any estimate on that?
Senator, I do not. We would work with the relevant government agencies to determine that number.
Okay. Now, under the under S 3485, the Offshore Act, Ms. Castor, I see under the authorized uses section of the bill that, quote, mitigation of damage to fish, wildlife, and natural resources is addressed. Are you concerned that offshore wind leasing poses substantial harm to state resources?
Senator, I would need to take that question back to the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management.
Okay, great, thank you. Appreciate any insight you might have on that. Mr. French, as to agenda item or Senate Bill 4431, Emergency Wildfire and Public Safety Act of 2020, this legislation includes an exemption for the state of California from the prohibition on the export of unprocessed timber of dead and dying trees. Can you tell me why this prohibition exists in the legislation and why we would consider exempting California from it?
Well, I think, that's a question for the authors, but I can talk about the situation generally. The only way that we can export dead, dying trees or logs from national forests is to make a determination that they're in excess of domestic capacity, and that is generally a very hard thing to do. It has been a discussion for years in areas with large dead and dying trees, like California, like we see in other areas that right now they don't get utilized because they don't have value. Yet there are markets that have developed, especially in Asia, where those could be utilized. And I think that's what's driving the intent, because right now we don't have the markets for those dead standing trees out there. They're not being purchased right now, and not in all areas. It just depends on where you are. It's really driven by the market forces.
Okay. So, so with California, but I'm not sure I'm understanding how that. I know this isn't your legislation, so I've got to phrase this the right way. Is there anything you're aware of that makes California truly unique in that regard?
The sheer number of dead, dying trees that you see in the Sierras, I think it's around 151 million right now. And the other thing that I'd add into this, I think it's a driver of this idea, is that the time frame it takes us to make a determination for export, you've usually lost the value in those trees by the time we do that rulemaking. It requires a rulemaking. And so this would change that. I do think it could certainly be looked at in other areas that have a similar situation as California, if that's the question you're trying to get at.
Right. Okay. Should we care about the destination of that material? In other words, when we're talking about the prohibition against the export of unprocessed timber, should that matter to us as a Congress?
I think it depends on the lens that you're looking at. And I think this is worth a discussion. If no one's buying it and it's creating a fuels and fire issue, then I think it's worth a debate.
Right. It's not as if we're concerned about it contaminating someone else's, becoming an invasive species or something like that.
No, and there are very strong safeguards in place for how we manage the export. I mean, we can manage, and there are certain species we export right now, and there are strong safeguards in place that manage for that.
Right. So this restriction under existing law isn't about that. It's just about a requirement that's in place.
Yes.
So that you have to get this approval before you can export as a condition precedent for exporting.
Yeah, for the majority of species, especially those in the Sierras in California right now, as an example, if we were to make that determination, which we've looked at a number of times, honestly, generally by the time you do it, the time frames for the value that might even be there for an export market are usually lost.
Thank you. Senator Daines.
Thanks, Chairman Lee. I want to talk about timber jobs for a moment. When I was growing up in Montana, there were 31 sawmills. Today in Montana, that's dwindled down to 7. What was once a major economic driver in Montana is now struggling to survive. It's devastating rural communities and the management of our forests. Commercial timber often provides the economic means to accomplish fuels treatment, restoration, and salvage work, and stewardship projects like those that are streamlined and prioritized in my bill. Mr. French, can you speak to the important role that timber companies play in completing work on the ground, and why is it critical we bring these timber jobs back to Montana?
It's critical. I mean, if you think about the comments that Senator McSally said earlier about her focus on us with Fry in Arizona, one of the big challenges we have in Arizona right now to deal with those conditions is that we've lost most of the forest products infrastructure. Where we lose that infrastructure, we lose great ability for dealing with this situation. Where we still have it, we're able to make progress. It's critical for our ability to prepare forests for reintroduction of fire. It's critical for thinning the forest so that we have reduced fire, and it's critical in supporting our rural economies.
Thanks, Mr. French. I want to shift gears and talk about the Blackfoot Clearwater Stewardship Act. First of all, I want to commend the proponents of the Blackfoot Clearwater Stewardship Act for their great collaborative efforts over the past 10 years. COVID-19 certainly has brought to light the importance of public access to our treasured public lands as more families have retreated to the great outdoors, including ours. This highlights the need to carefully weigh and deliberate legislation that affects public land management in perpetuity. Land management policy decisions can be challenging and divisive. We've worked on them over many years in Montana to find a place we can all land here in agreement, in a spirit of collaboration, and the management in the Blackfoot watershed is no different. I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the letters of support and letters of opposition I've received in the past year, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection.
Mr. French, my question is this. Proponents of this legislation have stated it will enhance timber production in the area. What change in timber production has resulted or result from this proposal?
From my understanding, Senator, the agreed upon collaborative approaches to restoration will increase, and the forests are already on a pathway to increase, but one of the outcomes of that should increase timber production.
And do you believe that this wilderness designation would in any way increase the risk of wildfire for surrounding communities?
Well, we manage wildfire differently in wilderness. We use different techniques. We use low impact techniques. If the fire is starting to threaten a community, we can change. And we'll go to a much more direct, harder fire suppression activity. So, that's the way that I would answer it, is that fires in wilderness are managed differently. If they're threatening communities, then we're gonna change our suppression tactics to prevent that threat.
In your written testimony, you speak to potential challenges accessing the recreation areas. Do you anticipate challenges to recreation as a result of this bill?
From the folks that I've talked with, I think those are issues that we'd like to work with the committee on to resolve some of those issues that we've heard about that access.
Okay. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Daines. Thanks to all of our witnesses for being here. This has been a fantastic hearing and been very informative. And I especially appreciate your patience with us while we're running in and out for votes. We do pay attention while we're here, most of the time at least. And even when we're not, it establishes a record that we can then review later. It'd be impossible for us to get the information that we need without hearings like this one, even though it's frustrating at times when we've got to vote in between. The hearing in this committee, for the record for this hearing of this committee will be left open for a period of 2 weeks for anyone who wants to supplement the record. And we will stand adjourned. Thank you.